Okay, so today is Friday the 13th, your lucky day. We are gathered together for the second of two talks by Dr. Anita Waters. Dr. Waters obtained her PhD in sociology from Columbia University in 1984. And that was actually where we met in New York City. We were both doctoral students. I was at the University of Pennsylvania and she was at Columbia, but we were living in New York City and doing political work together and got to know each other. And then there was a lapse of 30 some odd years. And thanks to Facebook, we have renewed our acquaintance and gone on to bigger and better things. And I hope we'll continue for the rest of the time allotted to us on this planet. So it's great. You really can renew old acquaintances. It's great. Anita is presently professor of sociology and anthropology at Denison University in Ohio, and apparently a shining star in terms of paying adjunct lecturers what they are due. We were discussing
Not
this.
me personally, but
Yeah, no. You need to talk to Professor Rivera there, who has done a lot of has been concerned about organizing professors, and she's very busy with the teachers, and they pay their adjuncts $6,000 compared to per course, compared to $2,500 here. Yeah.
1,700 got a master's degree.
Really? Oh dear. Yeah, that's right. You're teaching over in Generales. Yeah. This is, below poverty level. You know that, right? Okay. Anyway, you can also talk to Professor Waters about this because she knows a lot about labor relations and, negotiating and things like that. Okay. Professor Waters is the author of two books, and we have them both here. This one is called Race, Class, and Political Symbols, and it's about Rastafari and reggae in Jamaican politics. And she talked a lot about this. This was based on, hi Bianca, this was based on her dissertation. And I think there'll be some of this appearing today or not?
Not really.
Not really.
No.
Okay.
Yesterday, maybe.
Yeah. So yesterday's talk, she tied in the work to produce this book with more recent work that she had done looking at the kind of discourse that was being utilized, particularly at a conference in 2013 that dealt with Rastafari, in which women were incredibly well represented, which was a bit of a surprise. The second book that she's written is called Planning the Past, Heritage, Tourism, and Post-Colonial Politics at Port Royal. That's again Jamaica. And this is going to be more a focus on today, right?
A little bit.
This is going to be a very interesting thing. As a sociologist, of course, she utilizes the technique of ethnography. Now, in our class, we have not yet reached the chapter in the book on ethnography, but we've mentioned it as one of the parts of the toolbox of both sociologists and anthropologists, and of course, by extension, of sociolinguists, right? Or linguistic anthropologists. And so she will be able to share her vast knowledge of ethnography. She teaches courses on this topic in her university, okay?
But she doesn't have to go for sushi.
Well,
Doesn't have to go to what?
no, you do. They do.
Yes, she does.
Everybody
Yes, she
does.
does.
That's federal law. But here they call it SIPSHI. It's the, working with human subjects.
Institutional Review Board.
There you go.
Yes, we do.
Okay, the IRB. Yes. Okay.
Yes.
All right, so she's written many articles having to do with these topics, and her most recent article has to do with the way in which the Cuban Revolution is being remembered in Santiago de Cuba. So she's not just worked with Jamaica, but also with Cuba. And this is her second visit to Puerto Rico. Seems to be enjoying it so far. So we welcome you, and I will hand over the floor to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Alicia. And thank you again to the Department of English for inviting me. I'm really enjoying my stay so much. I love university. I had the opportunity today to take a little tour and take some pictures of the tower and the museum, and it's beautiful, beautiful campus, and I'm really delighted to be here. And I really appreciated my interactions with students yesterday, and I hope we can talk some more today. So when I had the opportunity to talk here about methods in particular, I wanted to talk about ethnography because this is the classic anthropological method that's based on the premise that real understanding of people of other cultures is best obtained through long-term face-to-face interaction, informal interviews, and participant observation. Since the late 19th century, anthropologists have really valued and depended on ethnographic methods. The years that they spend in the field, the remote field, of course, I spend all my days in the field of American society, actually, you might say. But anthropologists spend the time in the remote field, face-to-face with the subjects of their study. That's what sets anthropologists apart from other social scientists. And I want to talk about the strengths of ethnographic methods, especially what we call critical ethnography. That is, ethnographies that pay attention not only to the micro-level interaction among people, but also actions of social actors off stage that has, for instance, in the houses of government and corporations, that have end up shaping the interactions that you can actually witness on the ground. And I'll use examples from one ethnographic adventure that I took into Port Royal, Jamaica, to explore the distinction, especially the distinction between culture and structure, to show how ethnographic methods elicit narratives that form one intersection between humanistic enterprises and social science. So you guys are coming from a humanistic side, me from the social science, but I think we can cross paths in ethnography. So first, let's consider this distinction, this analytical distinction that sociologists make between cultural and structural explanations. For sociologists and anthropologists, culture consists of the shared patterns of behavior and associated meanings that people learn from one another and participate in within the groups to which they belong. Sir Edward Tyler, the influential British anthropologist of the 19th century, described it this way: culture, taken at its widest ethnographic sense, is that complex. I'm sure I'll wait a minute so people can find a seat. There's
Yes.
some right over here.
A couple seats over here.
Okay, I was saying.
Now I will shift behind the counter.
Okay. Sorry about that. We started right on time, which I suppose is not the right thing to do. Okay, so I was saying culture is described or defined this way by Sir Edward Tyler. It's a complex whole that includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by humans as members of a society. And by the way, I always clean up the gender-specific language. Don't like that. Don't let my students use it, and because it's not precise and specific enough. So, cultural explanations, of course, are really popular and very current among ordinary people. You're probably familiar with the most well-known of all cultural theories, and that is Oscar Lewis's culture of poverty arguments that he articulated in the early 1960s in books like La Vida, A Puerto Rican Family and the Culture of Poverty. In these arguments, in cultural arguments, inequality is explained with reference to learned behaviors, that is culture, instead of social structures. So let's look at social structures. Social structures include economy, demography, technology, infrastructural resources, and the resources at the group's disposal, including the material environment. So for Marxist social sciences and scientists in particular, the economic order in which one is born is the most profound of limiting social structures, in that it forms the basis of all other structures and of the meanings with which we regard those structures. So in the 18th Brumaire of Napoleon Bonaparte, Marx famously wrote, "People make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted by the past." So the past weighs on us and constrains our actions, limits what we can do. Demographic facts like age structure, birth rate, or population density of a community, these have enormous consequences for the way people behave and think. A community, for instance, with a younger population is likely to have more crime than a population with an older age structure. And it's not because these two communities have different values or one is morally better than the other. It's just the age structure that causes that difference. Likewise, structural studies of race and ethnicity show that when you have a tiny minority in a town, that minority experiences less discrimination and hostility than a larger minority in the same kind of town. So even just sheer numbers and make a profound difference. Likewise, laws, technology, and material infrastructure set limits on and shape our behavior, whether we're aware of it or not. And the two things I thought about for this was Awa Abdi, who is a friend of mine. She studied Somali immigrant communities in different countries. Well, there you go, in the United Arab Emirates, South Africa, and the United States. Because each of these communities was shaped by the specific immigration laws that intentionally or unintentionally select some immigrants and refugees over others, the distinct differences emerged in these three different places. Likewise, Richard Peterson, this is another one of my favorite books, Creating Country Music. He studies the origins of country music, and he demonstrates the importance of structures like radio stations, highways, and technological innovations in the establishment of the category country music. He shows that the system of production of recorded music that eventually brought us country music actually emerged, believe it or not, out of the furniture business, because phonograph record players were large wooden objects in 1920 that were meant to be put in your living room. So furniture stores were the places one went for a record player, and thus furniture owners had an incentive to make records to sell their record players. My first encounter with the distinction between cultural and structural explanations was in Steven Steinberg's book, The Ethnic Myth. And I think I just use this example because it's so clear, the culture versus structure explanation. He looks at the empirical fact of Catholic underrepresentation and Jewish overrepresentation on faculties of colleges and universities in the United States at a particular time, of course, in the 70s, I guess it was. Okay, so here are the numbers. So Jews made up 3% of the population, but 10% of faculty members. So more than three times the expected number on faculties. Whereas Catholics were 26% of the population and only 19% of the faculty members. So how does one account for this? Well, common sense wisdom posits that there's something about Jewish and Catholic cultures that influence success in academia. For instance, Jews value Talmudic study, and Catholics are habitually asked to accept the tenets of their faith without question. That's a cultural explanation. But Steinberg first picks apart these cultural explanations, showing that while they seem to be operating now, if you go to different historical and geographic times and places, you'll find that those differences don't make that difference. Instead of cultural elements, Steinberg turns to structural factors. He compares the Jewish and Catholic immigrants to the United States in the late 19th century and early 20th century. In other words, the parents and grandparents of the people who would be on faculties in 1970s. While both groups were poor, Jewish immigrants were literate urban dwellers with a relatively high level of occupational sophistication and experience, whereas the Catholic immigrants were peasants, basically. They came from with low levels of literacy and few occupational skills. So these two groups entered northeastern cities in basically the same time period. Catholic immigrants found work in city government, like, for instance, think about the classic Irish police officer, or the construction and staffing of the brand new subway system. There's an interborough rapid transit is one of the subways in New York. It's the IRT, and people say it stands for Irish Run This, because the Irish were the ones who were really running it. Whereas Jewish immigrants, and this was partly because of the discrimination that they faced, they started small businesses. And that these gave them enough resources to allow their children to take advantage of educational opportunities, which happened to be burgeoning at that moment, in that point in time, for no reason, reasons way beyond these immigrants' control. So there was a lot of investment in higher education, which meant college was affordable and accessible. The children of small business owners in the early part of the 20th century were able to take advantage of these opportunities. So the classic tale is the immigrant grandpa owns a candy store in the Bronx. His children go to City College for free, and it's at a time when there's a high demand for college teachers. And I say it's the classic story because I gave this example as the grandpa with a candy store in the Bronx, and the kid goes to City College, and one of the kids in my class came up to me and he said, "How do you know the story of my family?" So, but it's the story of a lot of families, so that's how it happens. I guess their children then come to college with us. So structural forces are only indirectly observable in ethnographic situations. Of course, you can't see the structural forces. So critical ethnographers must dig deeper and go beyond the purely cultural explanations, looking to social structures to help make sense of the empirical observations that you make in an ethnography. The distinction between structure and culture is maybe even more difficult for those of us who are really want to illustrate or see the power of culture. And this was my dilemma when I studied Rastafari symbols and reggae music and Jamaican politics. So we have to look for places where we can see the power of culture. And one place is one of the founders of sociology was Max Weber, and he used the analogy of the switchman. And the switchman is somebody who reconfigures train tracks. And he says culture is like a switchman. It moves the tracks along which action is pushed. But a more contemporary view of the confluence between structure and culture is Omi and Wynant. Their book, Racial Formations in the United States, can be, I think, extended. They're writing about race, but I'd like to say it's about social formations as well as racial formations. They perceive social formations as socio-historical processes by which social categories are created, inhabited, transformed, and destroyed. These formations have both cultural and structural components that work together. The cultural elements are representations, meanings, ideas, those kind of things. And the structural elements, of course, refer to the actual distribution of real material resources. So these social formations are very dynamic. They're pushed along through what they call social projects. They call them racial projects, but we're expanding it here. These social projects are efforts that interpret and represent racial dynamics, as well as organize and redistribute resources, which is the structural component, along particular lines. And these projects are important because this is where we find social agency. We find social power, the ability and opportunity for individuals and organizations to undertake actions that will both change how social categories are represented and ultimately how resources are distributed. So when a social actor launches a project, it aims to make a symbolic change. And I would say writing a novel or writing a poem might be a social project aimed at changing how something's represented and ultimately how resources are distributed. And I will go back to my talk yesterday for one good example, and that it was Portia Simpson Miller, Prime Minister. What she said about Leonard Howell yesterday, what I talked about yesterday a little bit, but she said at this conference in 2013, she talked about Leonard Howell. Leonard Howell was one of the first Rastafarians. He was one of the first people who preached that Haile Selassie is the Messiah. And in the 1930s, Portia Simpson Miller said, Leonard Howell dared to stand up against the status quo. He fashioned a movement to redefine the Jamaican cultural space by positioning Africa at the center of our cultural discourse and identity politics. our language and posture changed as we moved from being object to perennial subject. And I would say not only did language and posture change, but also, in some cases, income, job opportunities, and other real life chances. So that's the structural component that was a result of that change. So now, after all these words on slides, we're going to get some pictures, so I'm sure it'll be a relief. I'm going to turn to the village of Port Royal to see if we can illustrate some of these concepts and see if we can find ways where the structural and cultural elements come together in social formation. And then I also want to talk about eliciting narratives as one of the strengths of ethnography. So Port Royal is, some of you may know this, it's located right here on the tip of the peninsula, and it forms the entrance to the harbor of Kingston, Jamaica. It has been described, is often described in guidebooks, as a sleepy fishing village. But it has had a spectacular past. I'm sure some of you know this. It was a pirate haven. It was known as the richest and wickedest city in the Western Hemisphere. It's known as a site of a devastating earthquake in 1692 that destroyed 9/10 of the town. And it's known as a stronghold of British Admiralty in the glory days of Horatio Nelson. So I spent 6 weeks there living in the village with a student researcher and my 2 children who were young teenagers at the time. Now, 6 weeks, I hasten to say, is not long enough to be considered respectable or even legitimate by most anthropologists. Anthropologists spend years in the field, but 6 weeks was long enough to really open my eyes to a lot that's hidden from view. And starting with the fact that the only reason Port Royal seems like a sleepy fishing village is that the residents are often up all night. They work all night, they play all night, they socialize all night, and then when the visitors come to visit, they're sleeping. And so it looks like a sleepy fishing village because people have been up all night. That's why. Okay, so here's Port Royal again. You can see, yeah, that's it's a long way. It's 15 miles to the mainland from there. I was in Port Royal doing a study of how community residents felt about plans underway to develop Port Royal for mass tourism. The developers plan to restore the historical buildings, to build large hotels and a cruise ship pier, and they wanted to host thousands of visitors at a time in this little village. Now, of course, anthropologists, it would have totally transformed the village. Anthropologists studying tourism recognize the importance of studying the community in any heritage tourism development plan, because such development often overpowers, disenfranchises, and sometimes completely displaces the community around which the historical structures are located. Now, because of the long history of this community, in which many residents can trace their family's presence back 4 or even more generations, complete displacement has never even been on the table politically. In practical terms, tourism development really cannot move forward there without the cooperation of the community, because it's a very small land area and the proximity of the residents to the historical buildings make their cooperation absolutely necessary. So those who plan for Port Royal really take pains to obtain the endorsement of the community in their projects. The prospective developers of Port Royal at that time engaged in quite a lot of hand-wringing about the fragility of the community and its impending social organization breakdown. It was seen as really on the brink of collapse. But in the case of Port Royal, I concluded after my research there that there was really little danger of this happening. Instead of the poor, economically and politically disenfranchised, powerless community that I was led to believe that I would be studying, I found a robust, incredibly cohesive, and mutually supportive network of people who felt empowered and in control of their own destiny. Disgruntled residents there could easily have guaranteed that project's failure, and both sides were aware of that. The village of Port Royal consists of about 1,200 residents, and they're in two adjacent areas. The beach, which is about 8 square blocks of freestanding small cottages and homes owned by private owners, where we stayed. Actually, we stayed in an apartment that was attached to a private home there. And the Brotherhood area, which were housing blocks built as temporary housing in 1951. After the devastating 1951 hurricane. And these are the Brotherhood houses are cooperatively owned by residents under the Brotherhood of Port Royal Agreement. I'll go back for a second. The beach is like right here, and then the Brotherhood area is this area right here. Okay. The Brotherhood area is the poorest and most densely populated of Port Royal, and it's directly adjacent to the primary historic buildings and sites. And here are some of the historic buildings. There's the Naval Hospital, which is actually a cast iron building. There's Fort Charles, which has everything says Horatio Nelson here. This is Nelson's quarterdeck, and this was the battery. And these were my children and some of the other children we collected along the way. Okay, the strengths of the Port Royal community can really not be understood without reference to its structural characteristics. First, although it is small, it's very densely populated. Port Royal is relatively crime-free, so the children of Port Royal residents don't want to move out as adults, because the alternative is life in one of those garrison communities in Kingston. So census estimates indicate there were an average of 2.2 persons per room living in Port Royal, and I heard reports that of as many as 17 members of a family living in one Brotherhood room. Sometimes the children's families grow up and they build makeshift lean-tos in the yards of the main dwelling for themselves and their families, so there's multiple generations. The demographic facts of Port Royal mean that everyone knows everyone else, absolutely, and all of them have a strong sense of belonging to a specific place, and that's one source of power in the community. A second structural source of independence in the community is rooted in the economic facts of the village. One of the issues that confound developers is the concept of finding a labor force for the proposed development. Who's going to staff these hotels and cruise ship here and whatnot? And they want to say they're going to find that labor force among the residents themselves. And this is really seen as a condition crucial to winning the cooperation of the community. But in practice, Port Royalists tend to resist corporate customs. As one developer told me, quote, "Port Royal people believe that because they live in Port Royal, when they work in Port Royal, they can do anything. So they come to work at 8 o'clock, and by 9 o'clock they've gone back to their yard to eat breakfast. And then they come back in an hour's time, and at lunchtime they go back to their yard. No self-respecting businessman is going to allow that, so they bring the workers in from the outside." This is exactly how I observed the librarian worked. With sole responsibility for the tiny branch library, she opened usually within a few hours of the scheduled time and shut down whenever she needed to go home for whatever purpose, and returning later or not returning later, depending on how her day was going. But for anything urgent, everyone knew where she lived, so they could go and get her if they needed her. The ill fit, is that how we run here? No, I don't think so. The ill fit between Port Royalists and the shift work that developers would require for their projects is best understood with reference to these economic facts of the town. Port Royalists earn their living in a variety of ways, and fishing is probably the most important part. Fewer than 30% of the residents have completed secondary school. While Port Royal isn't a wealthy community, there is money coming in. Some retired residents live very comfortably on pensions earned from working abroad, they're returned residents, and others have stable jobs in Kingston to which they travel by bus or private car. Some live on remittances from relatives in the United States and Europe. There's also a very active, informal, non-cash sharing economy that's very traditional. Poor as some of its people may be, many people told me that a Port Royalist would never go hungry. There's always another community member who will share food and other resources with someone who's in need. Furthermore, fishing is a way of life that can support a comfortable and independent way of life. Some Port Royalists live like the pre-capitalist farm workers that Max Weber, to go back to Weber again, called economic traditionalists. Economic traditionalists work only enough to satisfy traditional needs, and then they don't want to work anymore. They're not going to work harder or more because they finished buying what they need to buy. For instance, one resident of the beach told me that some Port Royalists, quote, could go to fish once a week and probably get enough money to let them live for a week. So they're relaxed. They're not worried. When you talk about a job for 5 days a week, it's not really worth their while to do it. So are they going to go for the training to get themselves ready to do a 9-to-5 job or whatever? It's like, no, they're not going to do that. So third, infrastructure also plays a major role in sheer geography, really, in shaping the lives of the people of Port Royal, because the village was really geographically isolated from the larger population of Kingston. At the time I was visiting, the ferry, there was still a ferry going to Kingston, downtown Kingston every day, and it was a very slow but very pleasant and cheap way to commute to downtown Kingston. But there weren't a lot of jobs even available in that area of town either. The only other option was a public bus, also very time consuming. So while some residents did have cars, the effect of the transportation system was just further isolation of the community, which made them really reinforce their dependence on each other. So I'd like to turn now to two final points. One is what ethnographic methods, even critical ethnography, doesn't reveal easily, and then what ethnography is really good at revealing. So it's what they can't do and what it can do. So what's hidden to ethnographers is the everyday interactions of the powerful. The last time I visited the town, which was several years after I had spent that extended period of time, residents were still in the dark about the government's plans for development. Land had been cleared in 2001, and then I came back in 2004, and there was still nothing built there, and nobody could tell me even what would be in that spot. The decision-making processes about how the development would proceed were behind closed doors and were represented to me in interviews and in my interviews with corporate and government officials, and also how it was represented to the Port Royalists themselves was just not candid at all. It was full of obfuscation and spin, basically. This situation, actually I'm going back to that book again, reminded me of one of the impenetrable black boxes of my dissertation research, which was years before. I was studying the horrendous election of 1980. 1980, this election caused the deaths of more than 800 Jamaicans. And I call it a black box because it's one area of social action, of deliberate and influential social projects by powerful people and organizations that is completely hidden from the ethnographer's gaze. This is the specifically international pressure from the United States. In 1980, the People's National Party had been in power for 8 years, and Prime Minister Michael Manley was not in the United States' good graces. He had enthusiastically embraced socialism. He found allies in Fidel Castro and in the leaders of the revolutionary New Jewel movement in Grenada. Michael Manley had turned his back on the IMF. He turned his back on the Jamaican Gleaner, the main newspaper there, and on the national and multinational corporate elite. So he was a persona non grata in terms of the United States. Now, 1980, of course, was also one of the in the height of the Cold War, and the United States Central Intelligence Agency at the time had a budget of $8 billion with a B that year for covert action to fight against the threat of another Cuba. How the agency spent that money is a secret. but I believe that we can see the effects that it had on political culture. For example, in 1980, there was, just before the election, there was this sudden increase in connections between evangelical religious discourse and political discourse. The opposition Jamaica Labour Party was supported by a stream of evangelical preachers coming from the United States of America. And they were reinforcing the message that the Michael Manley government was communist and that communism was evil and atheistic. Manley was described as Judas, not Joshua, as he had been known, and it was said to vote for the PNP was to vote against Jesus. That's the specific way they put it in these advertisements. The JLP, the opposition, won by a landslide, and in the months that followed, new government heads, Prime Minister Eddie Seaga of the JLP and President Ronald Reagan in the United States, began their cooperative efforts to harness cheap labor in what they called the Caribbean Basin. And that phrase, the Caribbean Basin, also was born at that time too, which always reminds me of a laundry, where you take your dirty laundry to wash it in the basin. I was frustrated by the fact that I was expected to analyze this situation as if the $8 billion that the U.S. had put at the disposal of anti-communist forces in the Caribbean simply did not exist at all. Of course, that money had an impact, and we'll never know the extent of that impact. But to even suggest its causal power was to cross into the realm of conspiracy theories. But in our contemporary world, powerful people actually do join together and make plans, covert plans to influence social and political life. Of course they do. We can't ignore it and really understand what's going on in the Caribbean, and I would dare say Puerto Rico maybe at the same time. Well, Puerto Rico is part of that. Okay. So finally, let's have happier times. What ethnographic methods are brilliant at? And that is eliciting and uncovering narratives. And this is an area where I think the humanities, like your projects, and social science really come together. The textbook that I use for my research methods class defines narrative inquiry as an interdisciplinary method that views lives holistically, and draws from traditions in literary theory, oral history, drama, psychology, folklore, and film philosophy. The method assumes that people construct their realities through narrating their stories. Narrative inquiry values the signs, symbols, and expressions of feeling in language and in other symbol systems, validating how the narrator constructs the meaning. So in other words, it focuses on narratives as truly cultural products rather than, we're not on the structural realm here. In Port Royal, I was especially interested in the contrast. Actually, what this whole book was about was how each plan to develop Port Royal had its own narrative of history. So you can see the earliest plan to develop Port Royal for tourism was in the 1960s. And then there was another plan. There were numerous plans, like 5 or 6 plans. And you could look at the narrative of history and how it changed from 1960 to 2000 and something. So that was the narrative, the overall arching narratives that I was looking at in that book. But I was also interested when I went to Port Royal in contrast between the official history and the unofficial history. What unofficial historical narratives did people tell about their town? So we talked to a lot of older people, especially, to hear about their personal experiences. But among other narratives, our conversations with residents revealed a lot of history that is silenced in the official versions. For example, we heard stories about this 1951 hurricane, and virtually, 152 Jamaicans were killed in that hurricane, and virtually every roof in Port Royal was blown off. Every roof. Well, I want to say every roof, but there was one roof that was not blown off, and that was McSorley's Bar, a bar that has been there forever. And the reason McSorley's Bar's roof didn't blow off was a tree had fallen on it already, so it was safe. Also, they had narratives about the presence of the British military up till 1962 in town, and the history of the Port Royalist communal reciprocity, the sharing of resources. So we also talked to people about their views of official historical narratives. So given my own critical orientation towards official historical narratives, for instance, everything in town is named after Horatio Nelson, but then dig a little deeper and you find that Horatio Nelson was only in town for 2 weeks. He was in charge of the fort at Port Royal for 2 weeks. Okay, so I entered the fieldwork situation expecting residents to express their alienation from Eurocentric aspects of historical narratives that are promulgated in these development processes. So two results of this line of questioning were really unexpected for me. First, to my surprise and embarrassment, people interpreted my questions as quiz questions aimed at testing their knowledge of Horatio Nelson and Henry Morgan. Some people were very apologetic and remorseful that they weren't better versed in Port Royal history, by which they meant, of course, the European history, the English of Old Port Royal, and the naval base front and center. So, of course, I hastened to assure them that I was not asking them to recite colonial narratives of history. But I later learned that their humility is reinforced by developers who believe that residents should be informal, unpaid docents of the heritage tourism destination. And they chide people, they give the residents a hard time for not being up to speed on their historical facts. The second unexpected finding of this line of questioning was, rather than being alienated from Eurocentric narratives, Port Royalists expressed pride in their European connections. Their close association with the British military up to 1962, and the fact that many Port Royalists have some European ancestry, led some residents to embrace the British aspects of Port Royal history. Consistent with this comfort with Eurocentric narratives is the way that several residents remarked on the European ancestors in their own family. One person attributed her loquaciousness to Irish blood, and several residents referred to their Scottish or English grandparent or great-grandparent. For some Port Royalists, the European connection set them apart from other Jamaicans, so it gave them a distinction. One resident said, quote, "They say we speak a different language. They used to say we're very European and we didn't speak like the rest of Jamaicans," unquote. In their narratives about themselves and their European connections, we can clearly see residents making meaning through their stories, carving an identity for themselves and their neighbors that makes them unique among Jamaicans in general. This meaning making, of course, is strictly in the realm of culture, but it may well affect structures by empowering the community to make demands on developers and to exert their will in determining the future of the village. So what is the takeaway of all of this for students of culture especially, which all of you, I think, fit that category? First, we need to recognize the ways that social structures and material resources shape the meaning making that people accomplish in their everyday lives. Some of these structures are in black boxes, and I think we have to be aware of that. These are virtually unknowable, but they have observable consequences that we can see if we look in the right places. So we have to be aware of the structural conditions in which cultural products emerge, and keep open a critical eye for the way structural conditions are challenged or reinforced in cultural products. Ethnographers of people and readers of texts alike need to keep their eyes open and allow their preconceived notions to be overturned. On the other hand, on the other side of that equation, the way that representations are made have real ramifications for social structures. Cultural products like songs, paintings, poems, and novels can be projects that represent social dynamics in a way that ultimately influence how social resources are allocated. And I know, of course, I'm preaching to the choir if I want to tell you that literature is a powerful way of representing truth. It's easier to see, sometimes it's easier to see cultural products by and about the disenfranchised as having political or social intentions, but we also need to scrutinize the projects and the products, cultural products, that the ruling classes create, especially carefully, because the power that they exert is so often behind closed doors. So that's pretty much what I have to say to you today, and I really am looking forward to hearing about your own projects, and hope that this culture versus structure dilemma or dichotomy is something that makes sense to you in the way you're looking at your own projects. So that's one more picture. That's it. Thank you. This marker is the end of the underground city. All of this from here to there is what sank in 1692. So the meaning of that.
Anita,
Yes.
could you tell us something about your experience as an ethnographer? When you arrived in Port Royal, what did you actually do in order to begin your ethnographic observation?
Well, I started with a woman who had rented me her little apartment. She had a little house, and she had converted the back of it to 3 little really tiny rooms, not really apartments. I think there wasn't cooking facilities. There were just rooms. And so we had all 3 rooms because I had a research assistant and my kids there. And we started with her. I talked to her about her feelings about history, her feelings about the development that was going on, and I asked her all of my questions as much as I could. And we had multiple opportunities to talk to her and her daughter, who was a teenager, a high school student. And then her mother lived in town as well, so we got an invitation to visit the mother. And so we walked around town just meeting people, and we had a recorder with us. We recorded stories on a recorder, it was a tiny town, and we were there for plenty of time. So we got a chance to visit a lot of different people and walk around. We made ourselves as visible as possible, which was not hard because we were obviously not, anybody who's a stranger in town is very noticeable. And then because I had my children with us, little children just followed us all around, and they were very helpful actually. And I mentioned some of them in the preface of my book, hoping that one day they'll pick it up and see their name in the acknowledgments. But they were quite young at the time. So I guess just meeting as many people as possible. I had some beers at McSorley's bar, I'll say. Talked to some old men there, and we got some. Exactly, we got some great stories from old men at the bar. Well, in the afternoon, they have where we went towards the older people first, because we thought that they would give us some stories, especially about this 1951 hurricane. So you had to be of a certain age before you could remember that. That's about how we started. And then there was also, as I said, this tiny little branch library in town. And I love ethnography, but I really love documentary research too, where the documents, you can look at documents and they don't know they're being studied by a sociologist. They just exist. So I spent many hours at the development, the government agency that's in charge of development, to read those old plans for development, for example, and the Jamaican National Heritage Trust. So I did a lot of visiting of libraries at the time too, and the Port Royal Library has a lot of that material themselves about Port Royal itself, and documents that you would never get anywhere else. So, and they were very helpful. The librarian, who's I probably disparaged a little bit today. Yes?
Did you share drafts of your work with the residents?
No, I didn't. That's a good question.
If you had to do it over, would you?
Well, I think, I didn't share drafts. I constantly talked to them about what we were seeing and I think, I shared the final product with them, of course. The people of Port Royal, I don't think, I don't know how they would have responded. First of all, the draft of the actual project was so far in the future. I spent my 6 weeks there and then left. I have come back and I've talked to them about it then, and I don't think there was any there. Well, of course, but I wouldn't know whether there was any objection. That's a good question. I didn't, and I know that might be where we. Some people say you should do that. I've seen that with anthropology. Anthropologists have had some controversies over the years with what they've done. I have tried to give back to the community. Like we were talking last night in your class about what you give to the community, and I've given a lot of materials to the library there. But you know, I did not share drafts along the way. Yes.
I'm noticing how you're, at least with these two books, interested in Jamaica particularly, and I
Yes.
was curious how you went about to getting interested in the island, and much less specifically how you went to choosing that from what looks like a very small portion of Jamaica.
Right. Well, I mean, to begin with, I was actually, when I was in college in undergraduate, before I majored in sociology and German literature, and I was thoroughly oriented to Europe. I spent 13 months of my undergraduate days in Germany and Austria, and I was thoroughly engrossed in German literature in Austria and Europe in general. And by the time I graduated from undergraduate school, I was finished with Europe. I can't tell you anything more. Just like that was it for me. I have been back there a couple of times since, but you know, I was finished with studying Germany. And I was interested actually in graduate school I was a feminist, of course, and I was interested in family structures and how different cultures organize their raising their children and things like that. And I read a lot of Sidney Mintz, an anthropologist who's written wonderful work on the Caribbean. And then someone handed me a Bob Marley record and said, if you like Jamaica, you've got to listen to this Jamaican music. And as I was telling someone last night, that was like the top of a very, very slippery slope. I just, you know, went right down, and I just loved the idea of reggae, and this will be of interest to linguists here. It's just the way that the language and the way the representations of Jamaican culture in that music, and it was more than just Bob Marley, of course, the way that helped me understand what was going, or I felt it helped me understand what was going on in Jamaica, really was so intriguing to me. So I then wanted to, I asked my Columbia sociology department if they would let me study the way reggae music helps you understand, and no, they were not interested. Popular culture was like not an appropriate study for sociologists at the time. It's like not structural enough. But then I had the opportunity to go to Bob Marley's funeral, and I saw at Bob Marley's funeral, the leader of the opposition was there, and the prime minister was there, and I realized how reggae was connected to politics, and that they liked. That was okay. So they let me go on, and I had to do a little preliminary study of how showing that reggae music truly was influential in politics, and that they liked. So I ended up doing my dissertation on politics. I really studied political behavior and political culture rather than Rastafari itself. And then, well, I spent a lot of time in Kingston and had to go to Port Royal, which was a place that Kingston residents go there every Friday night for a big party. Fried fish and bammy, and everybody goes there, you know, for the big Friday night party. So I did visit Port Royal, and I just loved the community and visited every time I went to Jamaica. So I decided I would go and really look at it. And I want to tell you something else that I never worked in here, and that is one of the interesting things that make these plans interesting to read is that despite all the planning that has taken place from 1960 onward, nothing has ever changed.